Hello, and a very warm welcome to OSF's event series, Fueling the War in Ukraine, the EU's Energy Conundrum and Opportunity. This is a series of 3 events which OSF in Europe and Eurasia have put together to discuss with you the importance and, of course, also the impact of energy sanctions as a response to Russia's war on Ukraine. My name is Daniela Schwarzer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Open Society Foundations in Europe and Eurasia. It's a great pleasure to welcome a fantastic panel today, and I'll leave it to our moderator, James Cantor, to introduce all speakers in a moment. James will guide us through the discussion. He is founder and editor of the EU Scream podcast, and it's a great pleasure, James, to have you with us today. I think it goes without saying that among the different responses that the European Union has found to Russia's war in Ukraine, energy sanctions are, of course, of huge importance. The money that keeps flowing into Russia now on sort of the 3rd month completed of the war on Ukraine is tremendous. And we all know that cutting off those flows is one of the big elements of preventing Russia from waging this war much longer on Ukraine. There are, of course, other means that Europeans have found to respond, arms deliveries and also humanitarian aid, which is of key importance. But we have decided to focus for 3 consecutive seminars on the question of energy sanctions and their implementation. This event series is supposed to bring together experts and civil society activists, policymakers, if they wish to join us, of course, as well, to discuss from a EU perspective, from the perspective of Ukraine, and also from the perspective of Russia and other countries that are impacted and involved in this situation, to discuss how energy sanctions can be implemented, not only with the goal of weakening Russia's ability to continue the war in Ukraine, but we will also very much focus on the question, how can they be implemented in a way that they are acceptable and bearable to those who will suffer most from them? Because we all know that those sanctions come with a very high price. And our question here is, of course, socio-economic consequences, but also the question of political cohesion, both within countries that impose these sanctions, but also between them. And the question of EU unity has very much moved to the forefront, as for the first time now, with the 6th sanction package underway, there are problems getting all 27 on board, and Hungary stands out as one country that has been trying to obstruct the latest package, including energy sanctions. So without any further ado, I wish to hand over to James, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. As Daniela said, this is the first event in a series produced by Open Society Foundations on how the EU can responsibly implement energy sanctions. My name's James Cantor, and I'll be your moderator for the series. And today's event is called Fueling the War, and it's focused on why energy sanctions on Russia matter for curbing the war in Ukraine and how to make them effective. To introduce our panel, I will pose a first round of questions to each panelist, and I'll do that in turn for a quick overview of their positions. Those responses should be about 3 minutes each, and I hope they won't mind if we hold them to that timing. We'll then aim to get a more detailed discussion going. For those in the audience, your questions are very welcome. Please submit your questions using the chat box on the right-hand side of the event platform window. My colleagues will collect those questions for the Q&A section of the event that will aim to start in about 45 minutes. And one last thing before we get going, please note that this event is being video recorded and it can be seen on the Open Society Foundation's webpage and its YouTube account. To start us off, I'll turn first to Olena Pavlenko. Olena is a prominent energy expert from Ukraine. She's previously been a non-staff advisor to Ukraine's foreign and energy ministers, and she is president of the Kyiv-based think tank Dixie Group. Olena, can I ask you to please give us a sense of how important strong and effective EU sanctions on Russian energy would be in helping Ukraine repel Russia. And we'll have a chance to come back in detail, so please keep as close as you can to 3 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to be here today, and thank you very much to keeping your high attention to the energy issues, because yes, energy is part of the war, energy dimension of the war. So while the European Union is considering how long it will take to stop buying Russian gas, Russia is beginning to impose an embargo on the EU. New game from Russia, and again, very simple one, is to prepare itself for embargo, but to make the EU pay an incredible price for it. After the EU refused to pay Russia for gas in rubles, Gazprom began, one by one, to cut off countries from gas supplies. Those who were cut off the supply were countries which are considered as the most unfriendly to Russia, or that Russia thinks are unreliable partners. Poland, Finland, and Bulgaria. I want to remind that Ukraine already had several scenarios with Russia like this in the past. Also, the volume of gas supplies through the territory of Ukraine is now decreasing as well. After the interruption of gas supplies through Sakhanivka transit point, Gazprom did not increase the volumes of gas transportation through other transit points via Ukraine, such as Sudzha, which has 3 additional capacities. Again, it is not the EU that regulates the volume of gas supply to its territory. It is Russia that regulates its volume. As a result, Russia again benefits from the gas war. According to the estimates, Russia expects $100 billion this year as revenues for gas supplies to Europe, and $321 billion for the sale of all types of energy resources. This is several times more than last year. So it seems that EU's fear to make a radical decision to stop buying gas may again result in high gas prices from European consumers and surplus profit for Russia. In the case of a radical abandon of Russian gas, prices will also be high, but Russia will not be able to find such large markets as it has in Europe. It simply will not be able to sell as much gas as it sells now and earn so much money for the war. The same goes with oil. China is reducing its purchases of Russian oil, and the discount of the Russian Urals is more than $30 per barrel. So we also expect from the EU the announcement of the deadlines when gas supply from Russia will stop. If the deadlines are not announced, the European companies will not have this task among their priorities and will consider this as a long-term strategy. Clear deadlines will encourage European companies to negotiate new contracts as soon as possible. If the European Union is seriously considering an embargo, the deadline of the abandon of Russian energy purchases should be announced. Simultaneously with the abandon of Russian gas, it is important to build a more developed network of interconnectors in Eastern Europe. Yes, the EU has decided not to invest in the development of gas pipelines, but the construction of interconnectors as part of the strengthening Europe's energy security must remain for at least a few years. Ukraine needs such interconnectors to increase gas transportation capacity from Slovakia and Poland. If we are more integrated to the EU energy sector, if we have free gas flows between the EU and Ukraine, and if European companies use Ukrainian gas storages to prepare to the winter seasons, we all will build much more strong Europe tomorrow. And I believe that with the decarbonization goals and Green Deal implementation for the day after tomorrow, we all can build a common Europe without Russian or any other gas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you very much. I'll turn next to Sergei Guriev. Sergei is a dissident Russian economist who fled the country in 2013. He served as chief economist at the EBRD, and he's now a professor at Sciences Po, and he's the co-author of a new book on the way dictators communicate. Sergei, what would be the impact of strong and effective EU sanctions on Russian enemy on the Kremlin's ability to wage war on its neighbors, and in particular on Ukraine. Your 3-minute introductory remarks, please.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you very much, Open Society Foundation, for organizing this exciting event. I would say that European sanctions on Russia, on Russian energy in particular, are going to be a game changer. A lot of sanctions have been introduced, and they have had an impact. Some sanctions were actually imposed by the private sector voluntarily. Hundreds of companies exited Russia. Some private companies stopped signing new contracts for Russian oil and gas, and that also has hit Russian economy badly. Yet more is to be done. So the Russian budget really depends on oil and gas revenue. Russia in April received, federal budget of Russia in April received more than 60% of its revenue from taxes, direct taxes on oil and gas. Majority of the money is coming from Europe. US has already introduced an oil embargo, but US has always been a small buyer of Russian oil, while Europe is a majority buyer of Russian oil and gas. And so much depends on whether Europe stops sending money to Russia. There are several ways to do that. One is a complete embargo. Another one is a price cap, when Europe creates a cartel of oil and gas buyers, or buyers of Russian oil and gas, and says, we are not going to pay you more than, say, $50 per barrel. Another option is to introduce a tax on the sales of Russian oil and gas to Europe, and also, therefore, limit the amount of money Russia will get. A lot of people would say, when then Putin will stop selling oil and gas to Europe, to Germany and Italy in particular, the big buyers of Russian energy. But this is not going to happen because Mr. Putin is already running a small fiscal deficit, and he needs every additional dollar. He needs to pay his soldiers and officers whom he's sending to the front line, to Ukraine. He doesn't want to call for overall mass mobilization. Instead, he's recruiting soldiers and pays them about $2,000 per month. And then he pays the families of the dead soldiers about $100,000. So for him, cash matters. And this is the cash which is now coming from Europe, from $500 million to $1 billion a day, depending on the price, which would say it's quite a bit. So in that sense, stopping the flow of dollars will hit Russian government's coffers, and therefore reduce Russian government's capacity to continue this flow. Of course, energy sanctions have to be accompanied by sanctions on transportation of Russian oil and sanctions of insurance of Russian oil tankers. And in that sense, it's not just as simple as just oil and gas embargo. It has to be a consolidated effort. There should be secondary sanctions introduced on other buyers of Russian oil and gas that is being sold to third countries by redirection of oil and gas currently coming to Europe, to countries outside Europe. So it's quite a complicated package, but since we are limited to 3 minutes, I'll stop here and we'll be happy to follow up later on.
Thank you very much, Sergey. It's very interesting what you say about the tax idea, the tariff idea. And it's something that I think that Georg Zachman, who is our next speaker, may have something to say about too. Just to introduce Georg is a senior fellow at Bruegel, the highly respected Brussels-based economics think tank. Georg was previously with the German Ministry of Finance, and he's been with Bruegel since 2009. His focus is on energy and climate policy. Georg, just to ask a general question here, what would be a realistic and effective policy option for EU sanctions on Russian energy that also would receive consensus from EU governments at the Council? Over to you.
Together to this interesting debate. First of all, I would argue that we indeed need energy sanctions, not only for kind of punishing Russia and kind of changing their incentive structure, but also to get our house in order. So there is my big worry is that Europe is not going to be prepared for a full energy embargo from the Russian side for next winter, especially on gas. And kind of by having this debate on what happens if gas and oil is being cut, I hope we also encourage really the preparations on the European end to prepare for the next winter, because I'm quite worried that if we are unprepared, then Russia might turn off the taps, and we will be in a politically very, very difficult situation. So that is for me the foremost thing that we need to get in order, is preparing for a full cut of Russian oil and gas supplies in any case. Now, I mean, Sergei already mentioned that an oil tariff is a very convincing idea. It keeps the energy flowing. It is active immediately, so you don't have to do a long phase-in period. You can do it without obstructing countries in the European way. So you can essentially introduce oil import taxes on a national level, and I think alone this option will convince countries that are outside of the system to also join the common European effort. And I think having a joint European effort in the end will be better, because it kind of gives a legal framework that is harder to undo. I mean, it gives an incentive to member states for compliance, so nobody will try to kind of get some embargoed oil, because everybody is getting tariff revenues from the oil that they are getting. And the nicest thing, what I think from a political perspective, is it's quite flexible, so you can change the tariff rates depending also on the political situation. So it might be a nice tool in the political toolbox. On the gas side, I'm a bit more skeptical about a tariff at that stage, because the dependencies of Russia on Europe, but especially of Europe on Russia, are really pivotal. So Europe finds it very, very difficult to imagine a world without Russian gas. And that will be politically extremely difficult to bring across. But as Olena mentioned, Russia has started to play games on that, and we should stop to pretend that this gas buying from Russia is a market. It's not a market. This is pure illusion. We are now in a political situation. So what we, in my view, need here is a chief negotiator, a European chief negotiator that sets out our rules of the gas buying game from Russia. And maybe such a chief negotiator could come up with a sort of a price ultimatum towards Russia, saying, okay, that's the volume which we would buy at that price. And they might even claim that if they offer smaller volumes, we only pay small prices. If they offer extremely high volumes, we are only paying small prices. But there is some sort of sweet spot where we would like to land. Finally, what I think is crucial for both the price ultimatum for gas and the oil tariff is that we really are prepared, because otherwise it's not credible that we go out to Russia and tell them that's the prices that we accept. This requires both solidarity instrument to help the poorer countries or the countries that are more affected, and it requires tools that we don't like because they are environmentally not nice, because they are socially not nice, and so on. So we really need to get our homework done. And we should try to get as many of our allies join such an effort, because then it becomes more effective. So it's also diplomacy is crucial, speaking of countries like India and China. If they could join such an oil tariff, it would be much more effective, and it would be to anybody's benefit.
Thank you, Georg. Thank you very much. Our fourth panelist today is Sam Leon. Sam is the data lead at the London-based campaign group Global Witness. His work focuses on using publicly available and leaked data to expose corruption, often helping journalists and researchers in their work. Sam, can I ask you, could you give us a sense of whether the EU can bulletproof sanctions on a commodity like Russian energy so that any such sanctions can't be easily bypassed?
Thanks, James, and thanks to Open Society Foundation for bringing us together. So I would say that there are kind of three primary ingredients for making sure that any sanctions regime is bulletproof. The first of which has already been mentioned by Sergei before, but this is about the fact that sanctions must target enablers of the global trade of oil, gas and coal, because of course if they don't, then Russia may very easily pivot to Asian markets in particular to protect its revenues. From our research and work, there's obviously a broad ecosystem of enablers for the global trade in Russian oil and gas, but we're thinking primarily about commodity traders that provide transportation financing for oil and gas, insurers, that's liability and cargo insurers, shippers, so the owners of fleets, but also the managers and those companies that run shipping registries on behalf of countries, governments, and financiers, banks, for instance, that supply letters of credit in order to keep seaborne cargoes moving, and engineering companies. So these all need to be addressed by any sanctions package to avoid a successful pivot on behalf of Russia towards Asia. We also need to have a properly resourced enforcement regime. Sanctions authorities will struggle as we begin, if and when they're introduced and apply to the movement of Russian energy outside the EU. And then the third point that I would make was that we really need the active scrutiny of company activity by journalists and civil society. If there's anything that we've learned through our investigations at Global Witness, is that fossil fuel companies in particular will always push their activities to the line. Their statements rarely align with the detail of their practices, and often they focus much more on what's in the letter of the law as opposed to the spirit of it. So it's really absolutely critical that we have many eyes on where fossil fuels are moving, and the important work of investigative journalists and so forth is carried out to spot any evasion and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam. Staying with this theme of bypassing sanctions, it's been mentioned that 3 countries have been cut off so far: Poland, Bulgaria, and Finland. They've seen their gas cut off by Russia because of its demands to be paid in rubles. Energy blackmail is what the EU and the US have said. And now the European Commission continues to insist that paying in the Russian currency is a breach of sanctions. But the EC is not interfering directly in the way that some gas companies are opening ruble accounts to pay the Kremlin. So, Sam, can I just quickly bring you back in here for your comment on what to me seems like a very early kind of workaround to the whole sort of principle of sanctions?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the many instances where there's ambiguity in the current regimes that urgently needs addressing. I think one of the points that Alina mentioned previously was that the position we're in right now is the worst of all worlds, because what we have is sanctions on the horizon, but not yet enforced, which has triggered panic in global markets. So we have high prices, but Putin getting a windfall from this. So I think this is why we urgently need the 6th package from Europe to introduce an embargo of Russian energy and clarify some of these issues that currently there is no clear instruction on.
Thanks. And Sergey, can I bring you back in on this particular issue, the rubles issue? Do you see Europe's willpower to stem the Kremlin's cash flow reaching its limits in this regard because of this ambiguity, this kind of constructed ambiguity that's been created? Many have pointed out that there seems to be a softer stance on gas, particularly in this case where hard currency is later converted into rubles. Your thoughts?
Yes, I think this is a very non-important issue, which somehow was brought to the agenda by Putin. That was the time when Russia was afraid that ruble's too weak. That was the run on the ruble in the first couple of weeks of the war. By now, Putin is worried the ruble's actually too strong. And the reason for that is not the export sanctions that we are discussing today, but the import sanctions that were introduced from the beginning of the war by the governments and by the private sector that I mentioned, the companies who stopped any links with Russia, made sure that Russian economy is isolated from imports. Imports collapsed by about half. Russia stopped publishing these statistics, but by looking at other countries' statistics of trade with Russia, independent experts suggest that imports have collapsed by about half. When your imports collapse, you don't need dollars anymore, so your own currency goes up, becomes stronger. And then this discussion about the need to pay in euros or in rubles for Russian gas, this is not really a very important issue in macroeconomic terms. And in that sense, it's a small tax that Russian central bank de facto imposes on buyers of Russian gas if they pay in rubles. But in fact, Europe has stood its case, and European buyers of Russian gas pay in euros, and then the Gazprom Bank converts that from euros into rubles within the Gazprom Bank bank accounts. This deal helps to keep Gazprom Bank off the sanctions list, which again, something which will disappear once Europe wants to introduce the embargo. It will be very easy to introduce full blocking sanctions on Gazprom Bank, or even if Europe introduces price cap or tariff, it will be possible to introduce carve-out for energy payments, but still put full blocking sanctions on the Gazprom Bank if need be. But I think the whole discussion of paying in rubles for Russian gas is second order of magnitude relative to issues we've just discussed of full embargo or price cap or in that sense, I think we should focus on these issues, and also, as we've just discussed, make sure that we plug all the holes allowing for circumventing the sanctions.
Thank you very much. It's remarkable how big of an issue is made of the ruble payments in Brussels. So it's very interesting to get your feedback about how that might be a second order question too. I just wanted to go back to the idea that Georg outlined about a tariff idea. And I should point out that Bruegel was initially favorable towards a full embargo, at least on coal and oil. I just wanted to explore this idea of the tariff, though, a little bit more. I mean, there are some questions about whether whether a tariff might not necessarily increase prices for consumers more than the alternative approaches, and second, whether Putin might actually accept tariffs. Olena, can I bring you in first for a response to this idea of a quick tariff on oil at least, and then perhaps later on gas? Olena, your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you very much. So on taxes on oil and also probably on gas, which is less possible, that's definitely one of the options which are on the table. The question is, there are two, I think, issues which should be taken into account. First one is that this money which these taxes, yes, which will be imposed, there should be a mechanism which will enable collect this money. I think that somewhere in the EU on separate accounts, just to be able to track this money which additionally Russian companies pay. And second, I maybe will mention here the requests from Ukrainian stakeholders. I would probably support this, is to use some of this money also for Ukraine, for rebuilding Ukraine, because again, Russia, aggressor, should pay for everything it has done in Ukraine. And those 300 billion which are frozen already will not definitely be enough. We already need more than 800 billion. So Russia has to pay more, and if we can take money from their energy, sale of energy, let's do this. Second, I wanted to comment, if I may, for this existing sanctions, whether they work. What the US is doing, and I think Europe also should follow this, is just to monitoring whether these sanctions really do work. And in case of the gas sale, I think they still don't work because some companies started to pay in rubles. So, and then we come to the issues of secondary sanctions and whether the next package of sanctions takes into account the mistakes which happened with the previous sanction decisions on the sanctions. So I think the mistaken should be taken into account, and in the next package, the EU should actually impose something which is more hard in energy sector again. And also, I remember the Opal case. I don't know whether you know this, when there was a gas pipeline which was built and it was operating with violation of the European legislation. And Poland, they went to court, they won this case. And I think that actually shows that if European Commission or if some countries, EU member states, think that what's happening now with rubles is a violation of the European decisions, right, and statements, public decisions, maybe legal way would be also a solution how to stop this schemes, let's say, which bypass the European position. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you very much. Georg, I should probably bring you in at least very quickly here. We were talking about your idea, but you might also have something to say about the rubles kerfuffle that's been going on in Brussels. Perhaps your quick response to what you've heard thus far on tariffs and rubles.
I have kind of split views. I mean, on the one hand, I agree with Sergei that kind of the implications of this system as it is lined out in the president's decree would have been minor in kind of in material terms for Russia and for the European companies. But I think the real thing here is not about the kind of material thing of the law, but about the signaling first that we dance to Putin's tune. So they set up a new rule that forces us to change or our companies to change our contracts. So we feel so insecure about our gas supply that we are willing to do what they want. Then they use that to switch off selectively individual European gas consumers, thereby reducing again the supply to Europe, kind of moving up their monopoly curve a bit more and tighten the screws, make more money by selling less. So that and that for the first time showed that Russia was breaking contracts, which was an eye-opener to everybody in Brussels, because, I mean, the narrative that has been perpetuated over 30, maybe 40 years was they are always supplying in good faith. And now I think with that, we are out in the jungle. We now know that the world out there on the gas trading with Russia is not about legacy contracts that have been signed 20, 30 years ago, but it is about the kind of the relative power of the different players. And Europe needs really to wake up to this game. So it does not make sense that we have something like 20, 30 European gas companies that barely know their own contracts, governments that don't know the contracts of their companies on our side, while in Moscow there's somebody sitting that has all the contracts in his own hand and can look into them and try to find out how to play the Europeans against each other in the most effective way. So we really should take the signal seriously to now pull together everything under one head and negotiate gas with Putin as if it was a political negotiation, because it is not a commercial negotiation anymore.
Thanks very much, Georg. Just a quick reminder for those in the audience, your questions are very welcome. Please submit those using the chat box on the right-hand side of the event platform window. Sergei, you've written that a European embargo of some form on Russian oil and gas is the right economic decision because not imposing the embargo has larger costs and is more dangerous. That's an interesting idea. Can you compare those costs and dangers in a bit more detail for us?
Right. So together with Oleg Itshoki, who professor at University of California, Los Angeles, and the most recent Clark Medal winner, we wrote this column for German audience, actually, initially in Spiegel, then in Bild. I also wrote an op-ed in in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, because I think German audience needs to remember that even if you don't want to choose, as Mario Draghi has said, between peace and air conditioning, there is also a choice between losses and bigger losses. This war continues. As this war continues, the world economy is suffering. So the current downgrade of the global economic growth is already almost 1 percentage point per year. IMF and the World Bank have brought down their forecast for global economic growth for 2022 by almost 1 percentage point per year. This is a huge number for the world, right? European economy will also grow slower by about 1.5 percentage points this year. And the longer the war continues, the higher this cost is. And once you look at things like tariff or price cap, these things are bringing minor costs. Now, we don't know the cost of the embargo, what the cost of the embargo will involve. It is going to be an unprecedented event. But right after the war has started, a group of German economists, 8 top German economists, ran their calculations, and they showed that the cost may be actually as small as 1% shock for German economy. For Europe, on average, the shock is actually even smaller, because a lot of European countries spend much less on Russian energy than Germany. So there have been a number of calculations, and this is the calculus, basically. There is an additional economic argument. This war is disastrous for European economy, for German economy already. People are worried about price growth for food, for energy in Europe. And I'm, as a former development bank official, I'm even more worried about the global south. This is what people don't talk enough in Europe about. The food price increase, the energy price increase will be felt, is already felt by developing countries who don't have fiscal capacity to compensate their households like Germany would. So we should worry about countries which used to buy Ukrainian and Russian grain. These countries are suffering already and will suffer even more. So there is a huge economic argument if you think about those countries in particular as well.
Thank you, Sergey. And sadly, we're going to have to lose you soon because you might have to leave the session on the early side. So I wanted to get in another question to you right away, just to make sure we make the most of your time here. Sergey, to what extent, and I know this was mentioned a little bit earlier, but to what extent can Putin substitute sales of gas and oil to China? And how soon can he really do that? There's also this idea that we see a lot that China may be the only winner from an EU embargo, eventually getting Russian crude that's substantially discounted, but that still would represent revenue for Putin. Perhaps you can really untangle that for us.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So oil is transported by pipelines or ships. So it's impossible to build a pipeline overnight. So the question is if oil tankers can get to China. And in principle, they can, unless there are 3 elements: the transportation embargo, insurance embargo, and secondary sanctions. So the way American officials talk about this is China should be able to buy as much oil as it has been buying before. Now we see that China and India are paying 30% less to Russia when they buy, that's what we just discussed, right? When they buy Russian oil these days. And yet they keep buying Russian oil. India is buying a bit more. But in principle, once Europe and US say we act together and we will enforce secondary sanctions on whoever buys more Russian oil than, say, half a year ago, then major Chinese buyers will not do that. Notice that big Chinese banks on the second day of the war, banks like ICBC and Bank of China said, we will not finance dollar purchases in dollars of Russian oil. We don't want to be under American sanctions. As a former development bank official, I would mention that 2 multilateral development banks headquartered in China, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and New Development Bank, which is the BRICS Bank, where Russia is one of the 5 major shareholders. 2 of these banks froze operations in Russia right away after the war has started. A lot of big Chinese companies said, we are afraid of secondary sanctions. We will not sign new contracts in Russia, including, for example, Huawei, which said no new long-term contracts in Russia, which, by the way, means that Russia will not have 5G technology and may actually see deteriorating mobile telecommunications quality as there will be no replacement for the equipment. So all of that suggests that once the West is united on this issue, that there are tools to enforce that with China. Of course, there will be smaller refineries. There will be smaller buyers who would act informally, but it's going to be much costlier and much harder to move several million barrels a day that Russia sells to Europe today to, I don't know, a couple of thousands of small buyers. By the way, today, just one statistic which came out today is about a third of Russian oil exports, a third of monthly oil exports, 60 million barrels of Russian oil is sitting on boats in the sea, not being able to find a buyer. So it's already an issue for Russian oil sellers because India, China, other buyers don't want to touch this great oil because it may be sanctioned any day.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you. I'd like to come back to the issue of bypassing sanctions. And Sam, if I can bring you in here. As has been mentioned, we do see continued involvement of Western oil and gas services companies, including European companies, in Russian energy infrastructure projects, as well as in maintenance and repair, and so on. What is an effective mechanism to get these companies to leave their existing assets in Russia? And that's important since they are such an important part of the future ability of Russia to get its hydrocarbons to market. Sam.
Well, I think the incoming sanctions package, we hope the sixth package will have provisions relating to the facilitators of the global trade in oil and gas, although my understanding is that there was pushback from Greece, Cyprus and Malta, particularly on the provisions around the supplying ships, so fleets. And we've actually looked into that ourselves, but it's so I think sanctions certainly can be applied to engineering companies. I mean, just in terms of getting a sense of how significant some of the European companies are for the continued not only production but transport of LNG, for instance. One French company we have supplies all the LNG containment membranes that are used on the global fleet of ships. So we urgently need to look, and I know that there's already in the fourth and fifth package some provisions relating to the supply of technology, but it's not clear yet that those are actually having the cut through. And we believe, for instance, that some of these companies that are building these key components for LNG ships are still continuing to honour contracts and have ships in the process that they're building with Russia. I think that we need to continue to put pressure. I think there's been a degree of success in pushing companies and encouraging them to sort of self-sanction, but we do urgently need the sixth package to make it effectively illegal to supply some of these services to Russian companies and stop a successful pivot, as Sergey was alluding to China, for instance.
Thanks, Sam. And Elena, you've made the point that a phased embargo of some sort on oil, on hydrocarbons in the sixth round of sanctions needs more specific and ambitious national targets among EU countries. So what EU countries in particular do you think should be more ambitious, or at least can afford to be more ambitious? And indeed, there's been no outright EU ban or effective ban on EU vessels transporting Russian oil to third countries, or no outright ban that's been proposed. How can and should that be addressed? Over to you, Elena.
Thank you. So from what I'm here now, and I'm really thankful for this great discussion, it is really very hard to build like in middle scenarios, when we just, when Europe will discover again some scheme, to stop Russia, but not to stop Russia at the same time. Russians immediately will develop another scheme how to bypass these decisions. So I don't think we have a really like middle way scenarios when we will ask some countries to do more work, some countries to do less work, and probably we should come to the decision that all countries should decide not to buy energy resources from Russia. For some countries, it will be much more harder than from others, because someone has more access to the sea, to the LNG, for example. Some countries, especially Eastern European countries, that will be a challenge for them, and that's why I mentioned this interconnectors, building interconnectors in Eastern Europe, because that will help to diversify gas and other energy sources, energy resources supply to this country. So I wouldn't, range who would do what work, but I can say that those who are the most dependent on Russian gas, I think it will be not easy to make such decisions, but this decision should be done. I also wanted to say that this common voice, we discussed companies. And I think, of course, Europe now is developing its common voice in energy policy, finally, in energy security. But maybe among the companies, maybe could be a more coordination. I saw the case when Germany, it was in mass media. Okay, it was not official, but there was a quite complicated negotiations between Germany and Qatar, because Qatar wanted a long-term contract, while Germany, they didn't want to sign for gas purchase for so long. The question is if there is a more coordination among energy companies in Europe, and they can agree on some, conditions between themselves, maybe it will be easier to also negotiate with the suppliers as a group, not as a separate company. And of course, monitorings and lessons learned, which Sergei said, and Sam also said, and Georg, that we all have to take into account all the mistakes which were made before, all the schemes which Russia has developed to bypass, the sanctions, and make this, include this right decisions into the next package of this.
Thank you, Elena. A question for Sergei before he has to go. And in some ways, some of the research that Elena has done on this is very interesting too, but it would be great, Sergei, to have your view on it. Here's the question. Is the EU doing enough to ensure that Ukrainian energy needs, in light of the systematic destruction of the Ukrainian energy infrastructure that we've seen, is the EU doing enough? Is it taking enough steps to ensure Ukrainian energy needs? And I'm thinking here in all areas, electricity, gas, nuclear, and so forth. Over to you, Sergei.
Well, this is not something that I know well, but EU and Ukraine have done something really amazing in the beginning of the war by switching Ukrainian electricity system to EU electricity system, which is a big game changer. But of course, the war is going on. As Alena mentioned, we are talking about destruction of hundreds, if not hundreds, billions of dollars of physical infrastructure. And if I just can say, it's the good news is that EU is already talking very seriously about the reconstruction efforts, and there'll be reconstruction. And once security situation is clear, there'll be in reconstruction. But in some places, reconstruction will start even before the end of the war. But overall, it is striking to what extent Ukraine functions still, given the amount of destruction and Russian aggression. What EU is doing right now EU is providing fiscal support. The amount of this support may sound small relative to the overall destruction caused by Russian aggression and therefore the needs for reconstruction after the war. But every month, Ministry of Finance of Ukraine needs $5 billion, which is a huge number. So in annual terms, that would be equivalent to a third of Ukrainian GDP. And now, since GDP collapsed by 1/3 or 1/2, you can imagine that's almost more than a half of Ukrainian GDP. And Europe and US together have committed to provide this funding at least for 3 next months, which is a big help, which supports macroeconomic stability in Ukraine. And that is a huge contribution to the normal functioning of Ukrainian government and Ukrainian economy.
And Sergey, thanks for that. Just a final question for you. There's always a humanitarian dimension to sanctions, and you've made the argument that sanctions may lower the incomes of ordinary Russians, but you've then gone on to say that that does not mean that not imposing sanctions will necessarily help them. Can you untangle that a little bit for us to clarify that, what you meant by that?
James, yes, as long as this government is in power in Russia, it will shift the burden of the sanctions onto some other people, onto poorer Russians. On the humanitarian dimension, I would just emphasize that I've not seen American or European pharmaceutical companies stopping providing critical medicines, for example. There are some shortages. These shortages are temporary. They are driven by people stocking up, which I can only rationalize as if you see very high inflation, which Russia is going through. Russian inflation is predicted to be 20% per year. If you know that you need this drug and you know that your rubles are losing value, you would buy them up for a year. So it's normal to have temporary shortages, but it's not like the West is trying to destroy Russian lives. But financially, yes, the argument is the more Russian government gets in terms of oil and gas revenues, the more soldiers will be sent to Ukraine. It's not like Russia will use those petrodollars to pay poorer Russians or to build new schools or hospitals in Russia. We've seen that's not happening. We are not going to see that happening even if Russia is paid more. And in that sense, unfortunately, there are side effects, but these side effects are just an implication of the fact that Russian government holds Russian people as a hostage. And this is how sanctions work, and unfortunately there is no other way. These sanctions are not about making sure that Putin changes his intentions. Putin has shown us that he will not stop this war as long as he can. And so the point of these sanctions now is to deprive Putin of capacity to continue the war, or deprive him of resources to send more soldiers to the front line. And this is what needs to be done. And unfortunately, I cannot compare. You mentioned humanitarian dimension. Still, Russians face material challenges. Ukrainians are dying every day, and millions of Ukrainians are running away from the war. This is the biggest refugee crisis in post-war era in Europe. And in that sense, we should not, when we talk about humanitarian issues, we should remember that the most important victims of this war are Ukrainians and not Russians.
Sergey, thanks so much for joining us today, and thank you for your contributions. I'd like now to come back to Georg for a question that sort of gets to the heart of what the Europeans are able to do in this situation and what they're willing to do. At the announcement of any embargo, any sort of embargo, the expectation is that energy prices will rise. And this would come at a time when inflation is already high in much of the world. And expectations are also that Europeans at that point are going to have to answer a pretty tough question. What political price are you really willing to pay for your principles and for policies towards Russia? I don't want to be flippant about this, but Georg, can I ask you, what is the price point for Europeans?
I guess it will depend a lot on the circumstances at the very moment. And I mean, if the situation is that we, for example, introduce a tariff, and as a kind of reaction, Putin stops supplying oil and gas altogether, then Europeans will understand that this is not of our own making, and therefore might be more accepting of the relatively disturbing effects that such a supply stop will have. But there is indeed a huge challenge of the very heterogeneous effect in the different member states across different parts of society of stopping oil and gas flows from Russia altogether, or putting a high tariff on them and thereby increasing prices even more. So that policymakers are very aware of that, and they are also aware of the fact that from some European capitals, Kiev sounds still like a very, very far away city, and they do not yet understand that essentially the future of Europe is decided now in this war between Russia and Ukraine, and it's in the strongest interest of people in Paris and Berlin and little rural towns in the Netherlands that this thing ends on the good side for the Ukrainians. And I think I mean, what we're missing here politically also to a significant degree, I'm not a political analyst, maybe more a view as a citizen, is that there hasn't been the big speech by policymakers making, or at least in many countries, Draghi made this point that there's as you said, the choice between air conditioning and peace. But that speech we would need also in Germany, and we would need it also in France, and we would need to explain it more to the populations that there is more at stake than the price of fuels. I mean, what we see from Russia, and I'm just recently looked again into the food situation. I mean, they are willingly putting up a situation where maybe 10 million people will fall under severe hunger, if not starve to death in parts of the world, and they are just accepting that. So I think we should really be feel clear about what's at stake here. Now, my main challenge at this very moment is still that we are not prepared for the full stop, and that this will divide Europe away. And I'm kind of continue to repeat that, but I think that is the point that we must also make clear to our policymakers, because there are a couple of steps that we need to take right now to be prepared, and these are steps that are painful. There are things like the Netherlands could decide to produce more gas domestically. This will cause earthquakes, and the population does not like it, because they have had for 20 years, 30 years, a discussion on stopping that. And I understand that it's politically not at all attractive to go in that direction. France can build a pipeline over the Pyrenees and an electricity line over the Pyrenees. They don't like that for industrial policy reasons. France would like to have some energy autarky and so on. But they should do it. It can be done relatively quickly, and it would help the European energy situation quite a lot. It's political. It's not just a market. Poland, and we spoke about Ukraine before. Poland can start buying electricity from Ukraine. I mean, as Sergei mentioned, the interconnections are now synchronized, and if Poland buys energy from Ukraine, it could replace or make more energy available for the European Union, and at the same time, it could give cash to Ukraine to rebuild its energy system. They have surplus electricity at the moment, but there is some concerns that in the long term, it's not good for the Polish electricity market, and maybe also for the European climate ambitions. And Germany, last but not least, has still a lot of coal-fired power plants. Habeck now said that they want to kind of bring some of them back, but only if the crisis really hurts. Why not now? Why not save gas now and already now produce more electricity from coal? And consider really deeply to which degree some of the nuclear blocks that have to go offline this year can maybe stay in operation to save some more gas. I mean, these are things we really need to work on to be prepared. And here, policymakers are not yet up to speed to the challenge that we are facing, because it's not going to be a cakewalk. I mean, kind of people that say it's manageable if we take the right preparation. but losing 40% of our gas on a European level, and for some member states, 80% of the gas is going to be extremely difficult. And also in terms of solidarity between member states. So here on that front, more needs to be done, and that goes up to the highest level. We don't have a crisis group. We don't have people that are really kind of a high-level group of people that are sitting on a daily basis to discuss about the energy crisis and to prepare for that, which is crazy. If you see that as a war, you need a general staff that is essentially meeting daily to see the situation and to try to turn every stone to be prepared. And we are just sitting like the rabbit in front of the snake and waiting of what's happening next.
Georg, thank you. Again, earlier you had mentioned this idea of a chief negotiator on these issues, and I think you were sort of reprising that in those comments, which is very interesting. While we have you here on stage, as it were, can I press you a bit more on European politics and economics, that interesting space that you occupy? On the position of Hungary, do you think that the Hungarian veto, such as it is indeed based purely on economics, as the Hungarians claim? I mean, there are many countries and communities that stand to be heavily impacted by an oil phase out. So Hungary's position is hardly unique. So what's the balance here? What's really going on in your view?
Yeah, I'm feeling not perfectly comfortable discussing the Hungarian position towards Ukraine and Russia. I mean, it has been a complicated story for a long time, and I mean, if you look long enough back in Hungarian history, I think they should know on which side to stand. But let's see how that pans out. And I mean, the statements that we read in the press and from policymakers is it's more like getting financial concessions for Hungary to become part of the European sanctioning project again. But whether there's deeper political reasons behind, I don't know. And frankly, I mean, the embargo, as we I think spelled out all here, is not the optimal tool, and maybe the Hungarian veto helps us to think about better ways to kind of get money out of Putin's war chest and at the same time do less harm to European citizens. So I've not heard any statement from the Hungarians, but maybe you have on alternative ideas such as tariffs or price caps. Maybe they could be more open to that. And I was actually a bit wondering why some member states have been pushing with this most aggressive policy so hard without clarifying before that it's going to work. So might even be that some member states are hiding behind Hungary to some degree here.
Thank you, Georg. Elena, if I can bring you back in, I wanted to get you to spell out a little bit more, given that this really is an area of your expertise, what Ukrainian energy needs are in light of this destruction of the Ukrainian energy systems and its infrastructure. Sergei took us into that a little bit. You did a little bit earlier, but perhaps you could just reinforce a couple of points about what the EU should be doing more at this point to help out, especially ahead of the coming winter and perhaps even on nuclear.
Thank you very much. Yes, so as was mentioned before, Ukraine has already needs more than $700 billion as a result of this war. Energy sector has 2 billion losses in regards to infrastructure, and every month we need additionally $250 million to cover our gaps in the energy sector. I would say there are several ad hoc needs which exist now. First, our energy companies very much need like very technical stuff, like cables, generators, all these things which they can use very fast because of the missiles attacks, because Russians destroy our infrastructure, including energy infrastructure. And Energy Community Secretariat set up a special fund which collects money for such needs, and also they buy such stuff abroad and send it to Ukraine. So all the support from companies, governments through this fund in cooperation with Energy Community will be helpful for Ukrainian energy sector. Second, we have a huge problem with the payments, because people actually, they moved, they do not live in their houses, they do not use the electricity, but energy companies, especially those who supply and who are distribution companies, they need money for the market. And the decrease of payments, I think, is like 30% or 40%. And our generation companies, they need to find money to cover these gaps, and also the suppliers. So as of now, the Ukraine is actually asking all possible international partners to cover these gaps in payments on a regular basis. Hopefully, we will solve this issue after the war. But during the war, I mean, we have to fight. We cannot think also about this, and we cannot, push our people to pay for all the bills if they cannot find money for their living. In a midterm perspective, I agree with Georg, definitely. We should use our integration to the electricity system, to the NSOE, to be able to sell electricity to EU. That will help us to earn, transparently earn money for energy sector recovery. We also should be integrated more in gas sector. I saw that European Commission has issued a regulation which demands from the countries to fill their gas storages by 90% to be ready for the winter, but Ukrainian storages are not mentioned there. Okay, we are not the members of the EU, but probably like a sort of already involvement of our infrastructure into the EU recommendations, that would help Ukraine to attract more European companies to have business with. We also definitely need member status, or candidate status at least now, because it will help our companies to integrate and to have better business with the European companies, and do not wait for these governmental decisions. It will be more horizontal, more fast. And I believe it will help us to rebuild the economy faster. And preparation to the winter, I don't know whether I have 30 seconds more. I agree, this is a question, because I do not see that we are filling our gas storages very fast. And we definitely need to help from the European Union immediately. We have some negotiations with Norway. I don't know at what stage they are. But yes, the support and closer communication is definitely needed.
Thank you, Elena. I'd like to bring Sam back in and continue with the questions that we've been getting from the audience, some of which I've been putting to the panel. There is one about how we continue to see in the case of this war corporate interests taking primacy over the interests of people. And I'd like to get Sam's view on what I think is an intriguing and important question about what should be the consequences of continued corporate complicity in this war of aggression. So that's kind of looking ahead at what might happen to bring certain corporate actors to book for continuing to do business with Russia. Sam, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and one that we've been looking at in detail at Global Witness. I think make no mistake about it, particularly fossil fuel majors and commodity traders help Putin consolidate power through financing and investing in key projects and companies, Sakhalin, Vostok Oil, obviously BP and Rosneft, Total and Novatek. Some of which, obviously, there's commitments to withdraw from, but not all of those. And we see in many cases, particularly with the commodity traders, there was a sort of doubling down even after 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. And we really, really need to be very, very cautious when letting, allowing fossil fuel companies to bend the ear of politicians when they're thinking about these important questions like sanctions regimes. We're very concerned, for instance, that one of the responses on the part of the EU will be, well, we will have to make difficult choices, as Georg was alluded to. Perhaps that means burning more coal in the short term. But, for instance, pushing for a much greater expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure that will lock in emissions to come will really knock our environmental targets way off. And I think we need to contextualize this crisis also in the broad scheme of things. Putin has been able to exercise and project his power over Europe based on the assumption that Europe will continue to pay. And I think there's something intrinsically linked between dictators and the way they exercise their power in fossil fuels. Oil wealth does on the whole tend towards dictatorship and prevent democracy. And I think really, if we're looking in the long term, we need to close a chapter on fossil fuels. And I think we are seeing now that there are certain companies that are pushing for this to extend the life of fossil fuels and fossil fuel investments. I mean, the conversation going on with what this means for US exports of shale, for instance, and who's in the room around those conversations is very concerning. So I really do think we need to keep a very, very close eye on those fossil fuel companies, not least because they also hold the key as well to stopping a successful pivot to Asia, which is our first concern in terms of bringing a quick end to the war.
Thanks, Sam. Georg, on that topic raised by Sam, which is going to be the subject of another session in this series, but let's flick at it now. This question of whether we're going to inevitably build out much more fossil infrastructure than we would have done otherwise as a result of the rush to fill the gap here. What do you think is the capacity of the EU to manage this and to balance out these competing interests, energy security with addressing the unfolding climate crisis? What are you hearing on that? Thanks, Georg.
That's one of the most important questions looking a few years ahead. And my first part of the answer would be if Europe does not manage to keep its energy market together, if this breaks over this crisis, we will be in a situation where every member state has to invest on its own in security of supply, and we will have massive stranded investments in stuff. So the most important thing that we need to ensure is that the energy markets keep together and that solidarity holds, because that kind of alleviates us from having to build massive redundant national infrastructures. Now, the second point is that we indeed should invest kind of as little as possible in fossil infrastructure that locks us in the long term, and try to build as much as possible of the green infrastructure. Now, the challenge is that some of the fossil things are going to be much faster to be able to deliver than some of building up wind turbines. I mean, if you build an LNG terminal, it can in 3 years come in at full capacity and provide a lot of energy, while building up the same amount of wind turbines is going to take probably longer. Now, that should not kind of bring us into the trap of going too much onto the fossil infrastructure. And I have two a bit controversial thoughts, maybe to kind of spice up the debate. One is, I'm not so sure whether we should entirely plan of not buying Russian energy in the future. I feel that this idea that we are erecting an iron wall or iron curtain between the West and Russia forever looks unrealistic to me and strategically dangerous. So my take would be that if we would have had in the past possibility to build up alternative infrastructure that is available in the current crisis situation, and we are able to switch away from Russia if we are politically not agreeing, but we can switch back to Russia if they deliver us cheap energy and we are agreeing with each other politically, then we would be in the best of all worlds for us, because the dependency would be on their side, and we would get the cheap energy if we want to have it. Now, that is the first controversial thought, and the second controversial thought is maybe some LNG infrastructure is not so bad because it is exactly this option value. So if we would have had some 50 BCM of more LNG import infrastructure in Europe that would have not been utilized, so that would have stand idle, so we would have paid for 10 years for an idle infrastructure, it would have come extremely handy right now. And we should maybe think more about ensuring security of supply, not by pure diversification with full pipelines and full LNG terminals, but thinking about resilience and security of supply in terms of empty pipelines and empty infrastructure in which we can tap in a crisis situation. Because there's one big challenge that we are facing. Now we build up all this LNG infrastructure, and we plan to replace one Russian gas molecule by LNG gas molecule. But this LNG molecule is coming at 4 times the price. Nobody is going to buy this massive amount of gas molecules at these high prices for a long time. I mean, industry will be going to the US and elsewhere. Consumers will switch to electric heating and other stuff. So it's kind of, we are in a catch-22 situation here, and we need to find a smart way out.
Georg, a couple of responses to that. I'd like to ask Olena to address the idea that a door might be kept open to doing business with Russia and buying hydrocarbons from Russia in the future. Olena, that question I would put to you. And then after that, I really do want to put the question to Sam. And I suppose I would put it this way, that you spoke about substituting one molecule for another when it comes to LNG, but to some degree, when it comes to hydrocarbons, there's a risk that you substitute one hydrocarbon autocrat for another when you continue that trade with other parts of the world besides Russia. Olena, over to you first on doing business with Russia into the future.
Thank you. It's a complicated question. As a Ukrainian, I really don't like such scenario. As an expert, I understand what Georg's saying, but here we have a very big but. First, again, now Russia is dictating on what condition it supply gas to EU. It cannot be like this. EU should dictate how Russia will supply its any product to the EU, and we have to decide, and we have to do something to switch to this new situation. So my thoughts are that if EU stops and make some radical decision regarding Russia with gas and electricity, gas and oil and coal supply, then probably it can change the table. You know, the roles can be switched. It should be calculated more. I agree. There will be a high price, but otherwise we might have like this endless disaster when Russia will just continue still blackmailing the EU and dictate the rules. Second, if you have a business with an authoritarian states, and we remember that for so many decades, there were a lot of experts who were saying that, okay, Russia is not purely democratic country, but it's like semi-democratic country. No, it is not. And if we have a business with authoritarian state, we should have a bit other rules than its rules between democratic states. More transparency is needed. More reporting standards are needed to explain where the money will go. You see that some of the authoritarian states use money for the enrichments of their like top level of the country, and then you have extreme poverty in the country. You have the violation of human rights in the country, and finally you have countries which just support wars around the European Union, so on the south and on the east. And probably, I know, there will be attempts, I think, to do something on the north. So while you actually, do this and just do not demand from these countries to report more, so more standards, more strict standards to such partners, let's say, are needed. I agree with Georg that the centralization of power in the European Union in terms of energy policy is also needed. There were some attempts to create energy union. We remember that Poland actually wanted to do so, but it was not like it was designed. So we have to create an energy union. There should be a common voice regarding energy security. Yes, this common voice should take into account all decarbonization goals, definitely. But there should be also these benchmarks, red lines, which will keep Europe safe and will not allow those countries, authoritarian countries, which uses European money to create more economic, humanitarian, and other crises around its borders. Sorry for my emotional speech, but if we talk about whether we continue to do business as Russia, here I'm not only as an expert, but also as a citizen.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you. Sam, there's this question, there's this idea raised by Georg. Again, if I can, I hope I'm not overspinning it, but LNG and building out LNG is just a great insurance policy for Europe. But again, I mean, you're building alliances with parts of the world that may not be aligned with European values as such.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think it goes to the heart of one of the problems with the framing around this, which is just purely about replacing one molecule with another. I think one of the things that's been left out of this debate often is the need, and I know Bruegel has written about this, but the need for demand curtailment as well. In order to avoid this. And obviously on the gas front, you can talk about kind of much more ambitious commitments on efficiency, on things like home insulation and so forth. But on the oil front, thinking much more about how do we transform the transport system, electrification of freight, which is obviously a more sort of a longer term goal, but in the short term, thinking much more radically about how do we reduce private car usage or and I think these things really need to be brought into the fold, because it doesn't seem acceptable to swap out one source, one non-democratic source of oil for another. And I really think we risk doing that. I can't see why, that we would ever want to be in the same situation again. I know that, with Europe being 40% dependent on Russia for its gas and 25% for its oil, it just gives tremendous power to that country, with many of our refineries primed only to run on Russian oil. It just seems disastrous, and so I think we would never ever want to go back to that situation. I think so. Yeah, fundamentally, I really think we need to look very carefully. We know we have to curtail demand on energy in order to meet our climate goals, but this makes the situation even more urgent, because otherwise we risk just creating and aiding and abetting other petro-dictators, and this is not an acceptable situation. I do really appreciate that there are some very difficult decisions to be made here practically in the short term, but we really do run the risk. And on the point regarding sort of the, building out the need to build that LNG infrastructure, there is analysis out there from EMBA and the like showing that it is possible to phase out Russian gas without investment in new infrastructure. But I know that there might be sort of competing analysis of the situation, and your point taken that we have to prepare ourselves for a situation in which the taps are cut off immediately. So this is analysis taking us up to 2025, I believe.
Indeed, and this idea that we have such a small remaining carbon budget. I mean, there's really very little wiggle room here when it comes to the climate crisis. The degree of pressure on European policymakers to make the right decision and to move quickly in one direction or the other could not be, the pressure could not be higher. Am I right about that, Georg?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe on the question before, if I on the question before, if I may quickly. So I fully agree with Olena that we need a complete overhaul of the rules of the game. So if we want to continue, and just to set the record straight, so I'm not saying we want to continue as before. We need to really pull in a completely new architecture that prevents us from a situation in which we are currently in. So the rules of the game need to be written, and they need to be written by policymakers, not by companies. And that is absolutely necessary if we want to continue ever at any moment when it is appropriate again deal with Russia, and maybe also with respect to other difficult countries. Now on the climate question, my main concern is that we in the crisis throw out institutions on which we have been working for 30 years. Most notably the emission trading system. You have seen the proposals that came out last week about using emission allowances and throwing them on the market because it is opportune to make more money now and to reduce the carbon price. And I'm somewhat worried that we are killing things in which we institutionally have invested a lot. I mean, there's so much brain power that went into 4 phases of the emission trading system of the European Union, and it was the flagship project that was supposed to be our export tool for everyone to be utilized. That I'm somewhat worried that we are playing two short-term games on this front. So we should be very careful that our cap holds, and if our cap holds, we can do whatever we want in the short term in terms of emissions, because everything that we emit now, we will have to emit less in the future. But if we start to tinker with the emission trading system as a compliance mechanism, then we lose a lot of trust into the entire European decarbonization architecture. Now on the short-term emissions, again importing LNG on the short term and to replace coal in Europe is also not a solution. I mean, it reduces European emissions by a bit, but essentially it increases emissions outside of Europe because the LNG we buy from the market will essentially be bought from Japan and South Korea that then burn more coal. So we have not much to be gained in global climate terms on that front. So therefore, I would be a bit cautious to not overemphasize the short-term effects of getting over the next 2 winters, but all this should be combined with using the crisis as a catalyst for doing some of the heavy lifting on the renewables front that we have not been able to do before, be it wind turbines in some more sensitive areas, but also be it transmission lines, which have been a big issue in many European countries, especially in Germany. So if we can use the crisis to move faster here, maybe in the long term, we will actually be better able to meet our climate targets than without the crisis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Georg. We've come just about to the end of our session, and let me say a big thanks to all of our panelists. I think more than ever, we're going to be looking towards the next EU summit to see whether a deadlock there can be broken. But I think what's been underlined is that there are just so many other considerations here. The costs, Ukraine, a further delay, how to make sanctions on Russia really bite, and how big a price Europeans are really willing to pay in terms of higher energy costs and how fast and how quickly they're willing to move to clean, renewable sources that won't rely on any third country autocrat suppliers. So thank you again, everyone, and I do hope you'll join us for the upcoming episodes in this series. Bye for now.